So, good evening, good morning, apa kabar, konnichiwa, everyone. Greetings to all friends, colleagues, and students from around the world. Thank you for joining the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs online event, Decoding G20 Indonesia Summit, organized by the Konwakai Chair and co-sponsored by the Center for Southeast Asia Research. I'm Yves Tiberghien, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Japanese Research and Konwakai Chair at the SPPGA at UBC. This event is part of the Konwakai Chair series on the global order in the age of disruptions, with viewpoint from Japan, Asia, and other parts of the world. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers to analyze what happened at the G20 Summit on the presidency of Indonesia. Set amidst heavy geopolitical unrest and health crisis, there was a lot of anticipation for this summit regarding which global leaders would attend or skip it, what the overall impact of the summit would be in our recovery in the post-pandemic world. Would the G20 actually collapse, muddle through, or put a floor to the geopolitical crisis? So I'd like now to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people who have called this area home for many thousands of years and continue to do so today. Clearly, Indonesia just hosted a very difficult summit, possibly was facing the most challenging G20 agenda ever faced by any host. Yet Indonesia succeeded and even managed to get a consensus around an unexpected leader statement while hosting the US-China summit on the side and countless other bilaterals. Well done, Indonesia. So I will now like to welcome our very special guest for this evening, Pak Hendra Halim, Consul General of the Republic of Indonesia in Vancouver. Thank you, Pak Hendra, for joining us today. The theme for Indonesia's G20 presidency is Recover Together, Recover Stronger, and we're eager to hear from you about the crucial role of Indonesia in bringing together G20 countries to develop symbiotic relations and accelerate growth in a post-pandemic environment. Pak Hendra Halim was appointed Consul General of Indonesia in Vancouver in July 2021. He previously was assigned as the Director for North, Central, and Eastern Europe at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Indonesia from 2018 to 2021. During his career, he has been posted in Switzerland, Senegal, Mexico, and New York. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to Pak Hendra, Consul General of Indonesia.
Oh. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Yves. Distinguished speakers, experts, and then all distinguished participants of today's webinar. I think it's a good evening all and good afternoon, maybe in Asia, and good morning somewhere else. But of course, very pleased to see you all here. It's a privilege for me to attend this online webinar on Decoding G20 Indonesian Summit, organized by the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs of UBC and also the Center for Japanese Research of UBC, and then at this event. And I view this is an important and timely event for us, particularly as leaders of the major World Economic Group of G20 concluded the two-day summit in Bali this Wednesday. As we have many scholars of speakers and very prominent speaker scholars from over the world, I believe that their views later will give us deep perspective and knowledge and about the G20, the present and the future of G20. Without further ado, of course, I just want to highlight a bit, what Indonesia been doing during our presidency and what's the inside story. But again, thank you. Let me start, but I think why G20 is very important for us, for Indonesia. As the premier forum for global economic cooperation, Indonesia and the G20 is an important platform to influence global economic, financial, and trade policy issues. Our participation at the G20 provides an opportunity to strive for the aspirations and interests of developing countries to build a more just world. This includes serving as a bridge builder, peacemaker, and catalyst for initiatives to find constructive and innovative solutions to regional and global challenges. When Indonesia commenced its presidency in November last year, the vision was focused on global recovery. A year later, we faced different challenges: the rising of geopolitical tensions, food and energy crisis, and new challenges on health issues as well. And of course, Indonesia must make adjustment that the G20 remains a catalyst of global economic recovery. As Yves mentioned before, I think this year's G20 presidency for Indonesia is a testament of our resolute determinations to build consensus with members through collective action and inclusive collaborations in addressing the common knowledge challenges and crises facing the world right now. With the heavy geopolitical tensions, Indonesia endured one of the most disputatious presidencies in the G20's history. We view this geopolitical situation imposed the most pressing for Indonesia to pursue our role as a bridge builder and also as a key player for global solution of G20. No other G20 presidency, I could say, has had to face the geopolitical challenges that Indonesia was dealt with this year, hopefully nor next year for India. Despite the intensified geopolitical turmoil, the G20 Bali Summit didn't fail apart and went off without any major distractions, with G20 leaders agreeing and adopting the G20 Bali Leaders Declarations. Under the theme "Recover Stronger," our G20 presidency focused on three main pillars of global health architectures, sustainable energy transition, and digital transformations. The adoption of the G20 Bali Leaders Declaration is especially important as the Bali Summit took place at a time where questions on the effectiveness and usefulness of the G20 were raised. The declarations deliver concrete outcomes, such as the establishment of a new pandemic fund, the operationalizations of the resilience and sustainability trust under IMF, and the mechanism to support clean energy transitions, just along with the three priorities of G20. Other than G20 Bali Declaration also highlight the geopolitical issues. Most members strongly condemn the war in Ukraine and demands the complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine. This course can provoke us with different perspectives. Is G20 the forum for sole global economic operations, or will G20 be dragged or deal with security issues in the future? So I think this is very important for all audience today. Once I think the panelists or the expert would like to give this some perspective to all of us. I would like to highlight that the G20 Indonesian presidency also is a product of holistics, whole of government and society, as well as multi-stakeholders approach that witness the inclusion and contribution of civil society, private sectors, academia, and many others. For me as a diplomat and for my young fellow in Jakarta, the G20 is kind of like a good platform for everyone, for our nations, for our institutions, for individual, for the person. Everybody wants to be part of this G20's preparation, also the events. And under the inclusiveness principle, the G20 Indonesian presidency also invited guest countries that represents developing countries, small islands, developing states, and vulnerable groups to provide a wider representation of the G20. I also like to underline that the successful of Indonesia presidency in G20 is nothing without support from the G20 members and other invited guest countries. And that's why I think in the closing remark, our president extends his highest appreciation to all members and also the invited guest countries, for the support given to Indonesia. I must say that our success in concluding the Bali G20 Summit is also attributed to Indonesia's active foreign policy that in the past until today, in various issues discussed in multilateral, regional, and bilateral fora. To end, it's my ardent hope that today's webinar will serve as an avenue to discuss the evolving role of the emerging economies in the G20 and global issues, as well as to garner inputs to further advance the effectiveness and the relevance of the G20 in the future. And I look forward for the further discussion with the expert. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Pak Handra, for those very, very inspiring remarks. And it's really great having you today, along with our expert panelists, who also took time to enlighten us. So I will now like to introduce my two wonderful co-moderators, Rashi and Tanya, who are both MPPGA students here at UBC. And we're going to introduce our logistical announcements and also the speakers.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the technical issues. Here are some of the logistical announcements. The chat function has been disabled. Questions to be asked on the Q&A window. Please note that this webinar and the following Q&A session will be recorded. We will make it available on the UBC SPPGA/CGR website. You are not required to use your camera or microphone to participate in the Q&A. Written questions can be submitted to everyone via the Q&A function and upvoted by you. I will monitor the Q&A window and post questions using attendees' first names only. Here there will be some problems, but it's okay. We'll take up your questions. Further, we'll start with the introduction of our speakers. First, we have Maria Monica Wihardja. She is the visiting fellow at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute and a former World Bank economist in the World Bank's Poverty and Equity Global Practice. In 2017, she was seconded to be the executive office of the President of Republic of Indonesia as a senior advisor to the Deputy Chief Staff in charge of strategic economic issues, where she oversaw the food policy reforms and certainly prevention agenda. From 2012 to 2014, she represented Indonesia at the Think 20 meetings at the Los Cabos, St. Petersburg, and Brisbane G20 summits. I'll introduce her and request her to share her insights on the G20 summit. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Professor Yves for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. It's such an honor to be in the same panels as these distinguished speakers, including Alan and Colin, who used to be in the Think 20 meetings with me around 10 years ago. So I guess I'm the first in the lineup of speakers because perhaps Indonesia has just passed the torch of the G20 presidency to the next presidency, India. Indonesia's G20 presidency has been a huge success against all the odds, including the ongoing pandemic, the war in Ukraine, as well as the failure to release any consensus document in the ministerial level meetings and all working groups meetings, as well as the IMF and World Bank meetings. So the summit clearly exceeded everyone's expectations. Just a few months ago, after the war in Ukraine broke out, the G7 countries in the G20 threatened to boycott the summit if Indonesia did not disinvite Russia. But Indonesia staunchly upheld the consensus-based principles of the G20 and told its G20 counterparts that they could boycott the summit, but Indonesia would not disinvite Russia, but instead Indonesia would invite Ukraine. So the first success of the Indonesia's G20 presidency, in my view, is by preserving its unity and existence. We averted the G20 becoming G19. The summit, which was also the first in-person G20 summit since the pandemic, was attended by all leaders except President Putin. This was the fruit of the very proactive diplomacy by Indonesia's G20 presidency, including President Joko's visit to Russia and to Ukraine. Now let me decode the G20's leaders' declaration. The first part of the declaration, especially Article 3 and 4, which has the word war, were the part of the declarations that could have failed the Indonesia's G20 presidency from issuing a consensus document. Early in the drafting of the communique, to have the word war in the communique was not even in the consideration, because some of the G20 member countries will not agree to that. So to have that word in the communique, and more significantly, to have leaders recognize that quote-unquote security issues can have significant consequences for the global economy, and for leaders to commit that today's era must not be of war, was a real breakthrough. It will be a precedent for the word war to be used subsequently in other official documents. The second part of the declaration consists of two parts. The first part was on the areas that were not originally in Indonesia's G20 presidency agenda, but have become major global economic shocks that had to be addressed, namely the food, energy, and fertilizer security. The second part was on the areas that were originally in Indonesia's G20 presidency agenda, namely global health infrastructure, inclusive digital transformation, and energy transition, as well as the bread and butter of the G20, namely how to coordinate macroeconomic, financial, and fiscal policies towards recovery from the pandemic. Indonesia announced in the beginning of its presidency that it wanted to have concrete outcomes. And by concrete outcomes, President Jokowi means pools of funds and resources, initiatives, and projects. In his press conference at the end of the summit, President Jokowi mentioned 4 concrete outcomes from the summit. The first one is the $81.6 billion for the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund to help low-income countries and developing economies manage long-term challenges, including the pandemic, climate change, and macroeconomic risks. The second is the $1.4 billion for the Pandemic Preparedness, Prevention, and Response Financial Intermediary Fund. The third one is the commitment to reduce land degradations by 50% by 2040, and to ensure that at least 30% of global land and at least 30% of global ocean and seas are conserved and protected by 2030. And the fourth one is the $20 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership funded by several developed countries to help Indonesia accelerate its transition towards renewable energy and net zero emission target. And there are also significant agreements and commitments related to food and energy security, WTO reforms, access to green technologies, and addressing digital divide. Emerging agenda related to cross-border payments using central bank digital currencies and regulating crypto-based asset ecosystems are also mentioned. Moreover, all the bilateral meetings happening on the sidelines are also no less significant than the consensus document. For example, Presidency and Biden's first in-person meeting was very positive and signals some bridge-building efforts, although the long road is still to be taken. Now, moving on to the second part of my remarks, what the next G20 presidency could learn from Indonesia. I have 3 points to offer. First, the utmost priority agenda for the upcoming G20 presidency, I think, is perhaps to defend multilateralism and uphold the consensus-based principles of the G20. The Indonesia presidency of the G20 presidency of Indonesia demonstrated this by keeping inclusive principle to all members and adopting the soft approach of consultations and consensus-based decisions. Second, the fact that the 3 upcoming hosts have the agency to not choose sides. They could exercise this agency and take a neutral stance as the G20 host, who can credibly heard by all sides, both developed and developing countries, as well as among warring countries. Third, amid geopolitical uncertainties, the upcoming G20 presidencies must expect to recalibrate their agenda to respond to unexpected economic shocks. But at the same time, they must maintain strategic commitments and focus on delivering sustained long-term strategies, framework, and institutions to address the global economic structural problems. In conclusion, the G20 Summit this year is significant because it recognizes that the war in Ukraine and any other war must be stopped and prevented because of its catastrophic impacts on the global economy. And secondly, that multilateralism is indispensable to a functioning global economy. And thirdly, the G20 could and should provide a working platform for the global economic cooperation to take place amid intense global economic competition and geopolitical confrontation, because it is the only platform that we have. So the next G20 presidencies have the agency, but also responsibility and interest to be a neutral chair, build bridges, and keep international economic order multilateral, open, and rule-based. And Indonesia has set a high bar for the next G20 presidency. So let's hope they rise to the occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wihardja, for sharing your valuable insights regarding the G20 Indonesia Summit. And as Indonesia now passes the baton on to India, we'd love to hear from Dr. Swaran Singh, who is currently the visiting professor of Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. He's also the professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India, and also the president of Asian Scholars Association. So Dr. Swaran, if we could hear your thoughts regarding what you feel about the G20 Indonesia Summit, well, like what kind of a foundation has it set for India to take on the baton and, set the groundwork for the next G20 presidency of India? If you could give us some thoughts about what were the discussions around India taking on the next role and what were the sentiments like?
Yes, you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
And I'm going to play this slides. Yes, thank you, Yves, and thank you, Alison, and thank you to the team of School of Public Policy and Global Affairs to make me part of this very important panel. And I'm going to first share with us a slide. I could not use all 20 countries because you would not be able to read the names. But that says what are the top 10 economies that we are talking of among the 20. And the 3 countries that have made difference in last 10 years is Canada, Russia, and India. Russia has entered in last 10 years the position of 10th. Canada has moved up to 8th, and India has moved from position 5 to position 10 to position 5. This rise of Russia was primarily because of energy exports. So we might see Russia moving out of the top 10 list soon. India, by comparison, is the only country which is slated, which is to have 7 to 8% growth rate. So it could soon cross to reach the 3rd position among the top 10 countries. And that makes it very interesting in terms of time as to when India takes over the presidency of G20. First thing to underline is this very interesting tradition of G20 Troika. That means whatever happened in last 1 year, India was deeply involved in achievements of the G20 over last 1 year, because preceding and succeeding and the current country presidencies work together as one team. So India already was plugged in, and one can go and find various anecdotal examples of where India was playing what role in nudging certain countries and pushing certain countries in arriving at consensus. Second very important thing is this is also celebration of ASEAN, because ASEAN capitals were hosting back-to-back 3 summit meetings. East Asia Summit, G20 Summit, and now the APEC Summit meeting, which is a recognition of ASEAN's centrality to global affairs. And I think also provided opportunity to many of the leaders who are meeting again and again and again to build certain amount of understanding amongst these leaders. there were definitely hiccups for the final declaration. And almost 48 hours before that, there were even insinuations that G20 may not have a final declaration because there were issues of concern. And they were finally resolved. And it is not easy to bring out a final statement of 9,788 words. It's a very large joint statement. And it therefore required enormous amount of effort of the diplomatic corps, advisors, and politicians at various levels. But what also makes it interesting is that G20 is not an organization, it is not an institution, it is only a club. It's a group of 20 countries, 19 countries plus European Union. And therefore, what you see in joint declaration, final declaration, is largely the general commitments, sentiments. Nobody expects them to launch specific deadlines and initiatives and provide their structures. They are broadly supporting various initiatives that have been laid already or are being laid in coming years. Third thing interesting is G20, despite all the distractions, was able to stay on course. It is fundamentally an economic grouping, and therefore they must stay focused on economic challenges. And there are a lot of economic challenges: food, finance, fertilizers, fuel. There are economic challenges that G20 has to focus first. So if you read the final declaration, it mentions the word food 54 times, and it mentions the word energy about 43 times. It mentions economy or economics or economy 33 times. Ukraine is mentioned only 5 times and war only 4 times. So I think it puts things in proportion to make sure that it is understood what G20 is supposed to do and what it is therefore doing. And it is not getting distracted into other issues, because then it will be really laying it too thin. More interesting at G20, because as I said, it is almost like a club of 20 sheriffs, is what happens on the sidelines, because that is where much of the consensus is built, rather than formal nice speeches given to leaders by their speech writers. Each of the speeches are beautiful speeches, but where G20 has to go very often is decided on the sidelines. We talked of 10 top economies. You can see the chart here, but the top 2 are at loggerheads. And therefore that puts the onus on other rapidly emerging economies to contribute to this consensus building. And therefore those countries are going to play an important role, and did play an important role during last 1 year as to how gradually consensus was being built. Of course, the 2 top countries have to also build some kind of an understanding between them. Putin's absence, I think, was good in some ways, was bad in some ways, because a very important leader was missing from the G20 meeting. But of course, his not being there made life easier for the host nation to make sure consensus can be built and things are not derailed, and attention is not distracted into very, very different direction. I think the most important beginning was made by Xi and Joe Biden 3 hours long meeting on Monday. And that set the tone in some ways. But the most important clincher of that meeting, if you have seen the readouts of coming from White House and Beijing, are very different. United States emphasized how 2 leaders agreed on, expressing opinion that nuclear threats should not be made. But Beijing was completely silent on that. So interpretations of what happened are still very, very different. Of course, Indian Prime Minister's expression of this not being the time for war has, since Indian Prime Minister's meeting with President Putin, has become a kind of a phrase used by many leaders at United Nations. The same phrase also finds place in the final declaration. But the same G20 also for India had a very interesting a small handshake and pleasantries being shared between Indian Prime Minister and Chinese President. And because this is the first meeting of 2 leaders for last 2.5 years, when we had a border skirmish, and tensions are going on since then. And India is hosting the summit meeting next year, and India would like to see President Xi visiting India. So that could change the kind of tone and tenor of bilateral relations, could also make G20 far more effective. Indeed, India is lucky to have very cordial relations with all countries. United States and its allies, but also at multilateralism that I think we can stay assured India will be able to ensure that. Neutrality also is something India is known for. The meeting between President Xi and Trudeau is a matter of media speculations since yesterday in Canada and perhaps even beyond Canada. I will not say more on that. But India's presidency is going to focus on what is India's ancient tradition, and that is one world. World is a family. Indian Prime Minister has said his aim of G20 2023 is to ensure not first world, not third world, just one world. And I think that is going to be the emphasis of the broader theme of India. India, as I said, is lucky to have all major nations as friends. I also underlined India being the 5th largest and fastest growing economy. India also has already mentioned what are likely to be specific areas for focus, and that is my last point. And that Troika did underline that point already. India would like to see next year G20 focusing on climate. This declaration already has 27 mentions of climate. India wants to make sure digital transformation is the focus of next year. Joint declaration already has 33 mentions of it. India wants to focus on women empowerment in next 1 year. This joint declaration already has 16 mentions of it. So in that sense, I think the tradition of smooth transition from the last presidency to the next presidency should give us enough assurance that if you see India's imprint on the final declaration that came from Bali, you will see that same kind of effort moving forward, with Indonesia staying together as the last president in the next 1 year with India, and two together moving forward and taking the same agenda to make sure that there are some specific areas where consensus is really showcased by G20, and that is how it can move forward. It can avoid taking focus on security issues until it has put its own house in order as far as economic challenges are concerned, and that is going to the focus of India. And I think I'll stop here and look forward to other panelists' comments, and if there are any comments from the audience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swaran, for sharing your insights. And that gave us a really good sense of what to expect from G20 presidency of India. Especially, I quite like the concept of Vasudev Kutumbakam, which in Sanskrit means the world is one family. And that's what I think PM Modi has also been trying to position the narrative with the G20 presidency of India. And thank you so much. We now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Colin Bradford. And a little bit about him before he speaks and shares his thoughts. Dr. Colin Bradford is a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution.
I thought we were going with Professor, our colleague from Japan, and then to Alan, and then to myself.
If that's what you prefer, we could go with that, or you could speak now.
Yeah, right. Actually, we agreed to have Yoshiko Kojo sensei go first. Yeah.
Yeah. Our Japan colleague.
Asia Voices first.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly. I'm at the Center for Japanese Research right now, in fact. So
good. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So up next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Yoshiko Kojo, who is currently a professor at the Aoyama Gakuin University. She is in the Department of International Politics in Tokyo, and at the School of International Politics in Tokyo, and her specialization is international relations. She's also authored numerous research papers on global politics, economics, and international relations. And most recently, she's co-authored the book Taming Japan's Deflation, the debate over unconventional monetary policy. Dr. Yoshiko, if you could share some thoughts regarding the role of Japan into this whole theme of recover together, recover stronger, and what are Japan's takeaways from the G20 Indonesia Summit that happened, and especially maybe some thoughts about the bilateral discussions that happened with Japan and US, and any other significant moments that you could highlight, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you for a kind introduction. And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity with distinguished panelists. I'm very happy to participate in this webinar. Okay, so let me start about my overall evaluation on the outcome of G20 Summit. Okay, we are now facing a serious crisis in multilateralism due to conflictual relations among countries caused by the Russian war in Ukraine and the US-China tensions. I think that multilateralism is more important in tackling global issues such as COVID-19, climate change, and world economic instability than before. I thought that the Bali G20 Summit was an important event to examine the future of multilateralism. So frankly speaking, G20 could manage not to show the failure of multilateralism at the Bali Summit. So thanks to the leadership of host country, Indonesia. And contrary to most people's pessimistic predictions in the midst of the Russian-Ukraine war and the US-China conflict, G20 leaders agreed on the declaration anyway. So although there is not so many specific agreements on the recent critical economic issues, such as the high price of food and energy and the emerging market debt crisis, and also although declaration includes two different opinions on the Russian war in Ukraine. So avoiding no declaration is meaningful for multilateralism at this moment. I call this minimum but very impressive success for multilateralism. So I'd like to comment on 3 points regarding the Bali Summit. So firstly, so although leaders agreed to the declaration, as long as the geopolitical tension continue, it is getting more difficult to make concrete agreements among member countries than before. So Bali G20 at least confirms the necessity of peaceful resolution of conflicts, efforts to address crisis, and dialogue and diplomacy. This is good. So G20 also reconfirmed several important issues they were concerned. These are global food security, including support for Black Sea grain initiatives brokered by the UN and Turkey, and energy security, global health, and digital transformation. So however, it is clear that emerging economic countries in G20 do not want to choose between G7 and Russia, as well as between US and China. So G7 tries to persuade emerging countries to criticize Russia and support the sanction against Russia, but this was not successful. So the US and China competed with each other to take leadership in the negotiation. The US upgraded its relation with the ASEAN countries. So emerging countries try to keep their distance from these geopolitical conflicts. For Asian countries in particular, an era in which China and the US are not getting along is a far more dangerous one that they have been used to. So it seems vital for big countries to increase like-minded countries in the geopolitical divide. I'm not quite sure that it is good for future multilateralism. Mm-hmm. So second, I paid attention to many important bilateral meetings along with the G20 meeting. So G20 meeting facilitated the bilateral meetings. So US-China meeting was, of course, very meaningful in order to manage the present serious tension between the two countries, particularly regarding Taiwan. So Japan-South Korea meeting is also significant in the recent severe relations between two countries, so-called the worst situation for both countries in the post-World War II period. So considering the tense security situation in East Asia caused by North Koreans' frequent launch of missiles and China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, so South Korea and Japan realized the importance of mutual understanding for the sake of security. So the meeting of the US, South Korea, and Japan reinforced the security relations among them. So, and on the other hand, China was very active in holding bilateral meetings with other countries. So this behavior seems to show the intention of President Xi to play a positive role in order to increase like-minded countries. So third point is about Japan's policy. So for Japan, multilateral framework is very important for its diplomacy. A series of international conferences in this month is important opportunity for Japan to reinforce and rebuild diplomatic relations among Asian countries. So Japan tried to raise common interest and made efforts to sustain multilateral framework. For example, Japanese government put priority on global health and quality in infrastructure. So Japan is a host country of G7 meeting next year, and Prime Minister Kishida said cooperation on global health will be one of the important agenda for G7 Hiroshima Summit. So I just got the outcome of China-Japan bilateral summit meeting this morning. So both leaders expressed their concerns, but agreed to reopen diplomatic channels of communications. So this might be the first step for both countries to reconstruct their relations in the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoshiko. It's interesting to know about the multilateral framework that Japan is supporting, and I hope that more countries are able to, take inspiration from that and try and work towards progressing together and attaining the common goals collectively. We now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Colin Bradford, who is a non-resident senior.
Sorry, but it's Alan who comes next.
We want Colin to be the cleanup batter, as they say.
I'm really eager to talk about Colin because he was the first person to actually conceptualize about G20 and the whole think tank. And I just keep jumping onto that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We'll get back to you.
You can introduce Alan.
So Dr. Alan Alexandroff, he is known as the big man for G20 in Canada, unofficially. And he is currently the director of Global Summitry project. He teaches at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. And he has also been the co-director for China-West Dialogue and the V20 or Vision 20, which is an informal engagement group. He leads efforts designed to evaluate the adequacy and evolution of global symmetry and the institutional and policy proposals for the global order. Doctor, if we could hear from you what these bilateral exchanges at the summit and other multilateral exchanges that have happened, what do they mean for Canada and for the Western world, or maybe what were your key takeaways from the G20 Indonesia Summit that happened? What were some of the key themes that emerged in the discussions that were very interesting for you?
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry that you kept having to shift gears on us. Apologies. In any case, let me talk about G20 summits and to some degree specifically about this one. In the lead up to the G20 Bali summit, there was a refrain repeated in a whole variety of ways by various observers, and as we've heard from some of my colleagues, that question the continuing relevance of the G20, especially in the light of the geopolitical tensions, the Russia-Ukraine war, and of course, the rising competition between China and the United States. Let me give you one example. A good colleague from Cambridge University, Tristan Naylor, who has often been an observer and commentator on global summitry, and he wrote a recent piece for the G20 Research Group's annual survey. He said the G20 has always been composed of competitors of the world stage. But in today's historical moment, it is significant and worrying that rivalries are now becoming adversarial. Rivals can govern in concert. Adversaries cannot. As my colleague, Colin Bradford, who was slightly introduced, but will be reintroduced following me, has, excuse me, I'll have much to say, I think, about some of this shortly. But he did say, the Indonesian G20 Summit will be a test of whether the G20 can prove itself as a platform for effectively addressing geopolitical tensions to limit their damaging spillover effects. And I think he was dead on when he wrote that. I believe a fair assessment of the Bali summit is that, as many of my colleagues have already commented, it was a significant success. As the president of Indonesia said, our good relations with all the leaders are an important asset. We've utilized these assets so that the G20 summit can produce maximal and concrete results. And we want to continue to grow these assets. And I certainly think that India has already begun to grasp that in terms of its hosting of the G20 summit. So what does global governance look like based on past and current activity, right? There's an unfortunate tendency for casual observers and experts, abetted unfortunately by some of the best of the world's journalists, to see the G20 only through the lens of the annual Leaders Summit. But that is not the sum total of the gathering, and it misses the vital governing mechanisms that in fact really constitute a major aspect of the G20. A number of years ago, I wrote a blog post for a blog called Rising BRICSM. In fact, I wrote this back in 2011. And I called it the iceberg theory of global governance. And I said at that time, wrote at that time, it is frequently forgotten that the GX system, most notably the G20 Leaders Summit, is not just about leaders. In fact, there is a fair complement of personal representatives, ministers, and other officials, representatives of the IFIs, international financial institutions, the IOs, the international organizations, global regulators, and others, and then make up the GX system and make it work or not, as the case may be. And that's what I was talking about when I was talking about the iceberg. In the past, I referred to the in that particular blog post, I referred to views as expressed by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is currently the CEO of the Center for American Progress, but at the time had just finished a stint at policy planning at the State Department of the United States and was returning to Princeton. And she had just written a book called A New World Order. A new structure of governance, she said, was being created in international relations, right? Stop imagining the international system as a system of states, unitary entities like billiard balls, right, or black boxes, subject to the rules created by international institutions that are apart from and above these states. Start thinking about a world of governments with all the different institutions that perform the basic functions of governance: legislation, adjudication, implementation, interacting both with each other domestically and also with their foreign and supranational counterparts. States, of course, still exist in this world. Indeed, they are the crucial actors, but they are increasingly disaggregated. So what did Indonesia's hosting year look like? I was fortunate enough to call on a couple of my RAs to take a look at the Indonesian calendar, which Indonesia was very kindly provided through their website, at all the meetings held during the Indonesian year, including the Sherpa meetings. These are the folks who organized the final declaration, the ministerial meetings, such as finance ministers and central bankers, health ministers, digital ministers, and even foreign ministers meeting, right? And there are many task force meetings. For example, the Framework Working Group is one that originated in 2009 at the G20 Summit in Pittsburgh with the purpose of attaining strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. There are other task forces as well: climate and energy, integrity and compliance. And there are working group meetings. For example, for the first time, International Financial Architecture Working Group, and also other working groups, including the Development Working Groups and the Employment Working Group. And if you get beyond that, of course, there are the engagement groups, which Colin and I and others, of course, are very well acquainted with: the B20, the Labor 20, Women's 20, Youth 20, Think Tank 20, Urban 20, Civil Society, and others. These are mainly functional civil society groups, and these groups feed the G20 process. Think of the well-established B20, probably one of the most important of these engagement groups. In fact, more than 2,000 global CEOs and numerous other stakeholders attended the B20 Summit in Bali. What does this all add up to? Well, over the course of the Indonesian year, in fact, there were 128 Sherpa, ministerial, task force, and working group meetings. And if you add to that the engagement group meetings, feeding recommendations to the summit, then you get 257 meetings that occurred during the Indonesia year. So what this is a very complex governance structure that constitutes the G20. This complex has moved forward. It has developed and pressed forward on a variety of global governance issues. Some have simply been advanced. Others, in fact, as my colleagues have noted, have actually been concluded during the Indonesia year. But policies are moving forward in areas of food security, excuse me, energy, global health financing, climate change financing, and a variety of other issues. That's what we're looking at when we look at the G20. It's an error, in my view, to simply view it through the lens of the 2.5 days that occur with leaders attending, as important as that may be. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for explaining us that it's not only about how we are seeing these 2.5 days, but also like the 257 meetings that have occurred, and India for now has announced that there will be 200 meetings. So already
That's
Indonesia
right.
have exceeded that.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much for explaining the complex global governance structure so nicely. Now, finally, we'll be moving towards Dr. Colin Bradford. So Dr. Colin Bradford is a non-resident senior fellow of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution. In 2014, Colin Bradford was the first person to push for transforming the G8 to G20 at leaders level and help create the think tank engagement track, now known as the Think 20 for G20 summits. He's also helped host governments organized G20 summits in UK, Canada, Korea, France, Mexico, Australia, China, Germany, and Argentina to 2009 to 2018. So we are really waiting for Dr. Colin to give his insights on the Indonesian Summit. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Yves, for organizing this. And I'd like to take my hat off to you once again for involving students, as you always do, directly in these kind of proceedings, and even in our trips to T20 meetings in various countries. You give your students more exposures than most professors that I know, so hats off to you for that. I would just like to pay tribute to Indonesia especially, but to our colleagues from Asia, including Professor Kojo, for making it clear about the role of middle powers in the G20 and how important that is in making it a more complex forum and a more inclusive one. I think Indonesia did a stunning job, as everybody has said tonight, against great odds. It was a certainly challenging summit in which there was reasonable doubt about whether or not the G20 itself would survive. And the one thing I would like to say to Hendra Holland and Maria Monica Wihardja, who are our Indonesian colleagues here, is Yves and Alan and I had experience with a lot of experience and involvement with the Korean summit in 2010. And the Koreans were in a period under the Lee administration, the Lee government, of engagement with the world and punching above its weight is what we called it, as a middle power. And what happened, and they did it, they ran a very good summit under very trying circumstances. But they ran a very good summit. But the warning I would like to just flag for you is, and for Indonesia as a whole, is that unfortunately, because mostly of a change of government and personality and presidents, but is to be careful to not let the idea of Indonesia's G20 leadership at this moment be tagged as only that of your current President Widodo, but rather as a national achievement, which needs to be carried forward regardless of who your leadership is, because the country made it happen and the country deserves to continue and will profit and benefit from continuing as a strong middle power in the global system and in the G20 in particular. I would have to say that the Prime Minister Harper, who succeeded Paul Martin, who had been the father of the G20 at finance minister level and a very prominent voice, to say the least, in pushing for the G8 to become the G20. Prime Minister Harper made the mistake of giving prominence to the G7 during the Canadian G20 year. And and the reason for that was very parochial, is that he thought that the G20 was Paul Martin's idea, that Paul Martin was the opposite party, and that therefore it wasn't his idea. He should have rather, I give this to you because it's a serious problem, I think, for you to face in the future, because you want to maintain what you've just achieved. And that is to be quite frank, I think Harper was being very small-minded. I think it was a Canadian achievement, and that's the way he should have pitched it. And he should have run the G20 as much his idea as anybody else's, or not his idea, not Paul Martin's idea, but just a great idea. So having said that, let me just move quickly forward. And because the comments so far have raised something for me, and Alan and I have been discussing this week as we've watched your summit, the Indonesian summit, unfold, is what is the G20 exactly? And I think we perceive that there have been misconceptions all along, and some of which were manifested during this week. A friend of ours, a Canadian, that some of you will know, Andy Cooper, wrote an article in the magazine that John Curtin, another Canadian from the University of Toronto, who puts out a very slick magazine every year for the G20. Andy wrote an article and said that the G20 is an informal apex focal point. And so what he means by that, I think it's a very useful idea. It is an apex. It is the leaders of the largest countries, that's for sure. It is informal, and it is a flow point for a force field, as Alan has pointed out, of a variety from a variety of sources that lead to a form of governance, which I think we need to examine. So let me go on and tick off some more things. So it's not actually just a group. And what I will argue is that it also is, the G20 is not an institution, that it should not limit itself just to economics, that it is not a value-driven group like the G7, and it's not a decision-making group either, or shouldn't be looked at primarily as a decision-making group. So let me just go through quickly these points because it's getting on in terms of the amount of time that you have for this, and I'll try to just summarize these points and then we can have a conversation. So I've argued already that it's not a group, it's a process, and it's a form of governance. And it's a form of governance by being also, the second point is that it is a network of networks. And so Anne-Marie Slaughter has written a lot about networks, and this is the G20 is a network of networks in just the way that Alan described it a minute ago. And it is also importantly based on size, and which is a fairly neutral concept, in fact. It's not based on values, and it's not based on regime type, which is extremely important. So it is not the G7, and I think as Professor Kojo pointed out, the G7 has making a mistake by values are important and should be able to be expressed in the world, and it's fine for the G7 to strengthen the commitments that individuals and nations may have towards democratic forms of governance, but it's not a good idea to use it as a foreign policy to drive your foreign policy, because the fact of the matter is that well over a third of the world, as you said, Professor Kojo, is that it does not want to choose based on regime type between authoritarianism on the one side and democracy on the other, or as the Biden administration would put, democracy versus autocracy, that this is not a helpful thing in a world in which we see in the United Nations some 50 to 70 countries who are abstaining from resolutions precisely in order to avoid choosing sides. So the other thing that it is the G20 should have as its mandate, as we've argued, Yves, Alan, and I have been co-chaired something called the Vision 20. It should be a forum in which the focus is on strategic issues and strategic visioning. So systemic challenges are obviously what is in front of us, and those are what I mean by strategic issues. It's not so much a decision-making forum, actually. And I think, you know, our friend Alan Beattie at the Financial Times has been dickering about this since 2009, when he thought that even the London G20 summit was a failure, which it certainly was not, is that I think he expects it to be a decision-making forum, which it can't be when you stop to think of it, because behind every government, regardless of how authoritarian it may be or not, there are other groups that have influence on decisions, and they're domestically driven groups. And so, and in the case of democracies, for sure, parliaments are the ones who tax and generate government revenues, and parliaments are the ultimate decision makers about appropriation, that is, commitments of funds. And so you cannot have a situation, and this is one of the reasons why the climate change creeps along as much as it does, or as little as it does. And for example, in the PPR issue of the pandemic preparation and prevention and response mechanism is underfunded. And the reason isn't that the leaders don't want to fund it, is that parliaments haven't. And so you get to this realization that the G20 is really there to push, does have ambition. I mean, I think the leaders generally do, almost all of them, with the exception of Trump when he was president of the United States, understand the climate issue. And so the ambition is there. And so what the G20 does is push what I've come to call the frontier of the feasible, rather than articulate a lofty goal which can't be met, and then causes real backlash because people feel that it's failed. So the final point I would make, so it's not to look at it as a decision-making body, I think is tempting, but it leads you automatically to the kind of criticism that we just mentioned ago by our friend Alan Beattie, because he's expecting the wrong thing from it. The final thing that I want to just make a point of, which is perhaps the most important point, is that this is ultimately a process that ends up as, if you think of it as Andy Cooper did, as an informal apex focal point. Ultimately, it is a leaders summit, and it is made up of governments. And therefore, even though finance ministers and economists generally, I'm an economist, make a living by trying to say that economics is a science and that it's not political, the fact is that economic policy is about as political a thing as you can get. And that politics is okay, but we need to own it and understand that that's what it's about. And to understand one further detail, which goes back to the point that I made at the beginning about the importance of middle powers. And that is that pluralism in geopolitics and global governance is a good thing. Pluralism is a good thing. It's in the interests of the United States to not have a world that turns into blocks, but rather to have, exactly as Professor Kojo described it, a world in which countries do not wish to align always and everywhere with the same set of countries, but rather shift their position based on the policy challenges that stand in front of them. And that will change over time. That's something we call shifting coalitions of consensus are better than blocks. That's the way we've summarized it in 2010, actually, for the Korean summit with Stuart Patrick. So if you understand that, all of a sudden you begin to realize that pluralism is a powerful mechanism for depolarizing ideological debates, value-driven debates like the autocracy versus democracy issue, and furthermore, leading you to pragmatism and professionalism about focusing on policy decisions and details, where complexity is also your friend. The more complex the conversation that's necessary to resolve an issue, the less likely it is to be driven by ideological issues. So we think that what's happened, Alan and I are co-chairs of something called the China-West Dialogue. We've been pushing pluralism as a way to defang the US bilateral tensions and confrontational narratives. And we think what happened over this last week, thanks to Indonesia, thanks to President Biden and President Xi for having as good a conversation as they did, that all of a sudden there began to be a shift from bilateral, bipolar, conflicting narratives between the US and China to pluralism. And the Europeans are keen on maintaining strategic autonomy. China is actually, in a conversation that President Xi had with President Macron, is interested in having Europe, not only interested in having Europe be engaged in strategic autonomy, I think is looking for strategic autonomy itself. I think every country except perhaps the United States is looking for strategic autonomy. And that's, I think, in the long run, the US interest, because the more pluralistic the political force field is, the less ideological it'll be, the more likely that people can make convergent rather than divergent decisions and pathways towards progress. And therefore, I think the Indonesian summit really was a place where, in fact, geopolitics were dealt with in such a way that global governance could be dealt with in the ambitious way that it was in the second half of the declaration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bradford, for clearing up some myths about G20 not being a group, but being a process and a network of networks, because I think most people have a misconception that whenever you say what's G20, they're like, oh, it's a group of 20 countries. So yeah, in my next conversations, I'm definitely going to be talking to everyone about how it's not a group. It's a process and it's a network of networks. And also about, I was particularly intrigued by the dilemma of decision making in local context. I think those are some new perspectives for us to think about, and also about pluralism, and also the remark you made about US. I think that was particularly interesting. That brings us to the closure of our introductory remarks from our speakers. We are super excited to deep dive further into this and get into the Q&A part of this webinar. We want to know more about the key highlights and also the impact on not just the Indo-Pacific region, but the global order, some interesting dynamics that might have been observed at the summit. The forum is now open to audiences. You are free to talk and ask questions about any doubts you might have or anything you would want to know about the G20 Summit in the chat section. We'll try and cover those questions. But just to start it off, I'll ask the first question, and then we'll keep moderating the chat section for any other interesting questions. The first question I would like to ask is G20 presidency of Indonesia. How was it in terms of the process? How did it function? Keeping in mind that there was a very heavy geopolitical tension behind this whole summit that happened, particularly with the Russian war in Ukraine and the Sino-US tensions. How did it all play out on ground there in Bali, Indonesia? My question would be particularly for Dr. Allen and Dr. Monica and anybody else who would want to share their thoughts on this.
Well, let me just say, and again, my focus tends to be, okay, so what the governance, the complex governance aspects of the G20 in particular are really all the different gatherings and meetings that go on. I mean, unfortunately, as I point out, most of the folks who look at the G20 simply ignore most of what, admittedly, it's not all that broadly public, but ignore all the very hard work that goes on and the numerous meetings that take place and have to be organized, and the filtering of that information and those recommendations up through to the leaders. And to me, it's that complexity there, and that you work out some of the issues. Now, yes, the geopolitics is evident, but that's more at, again, at the leaders level. And even before that leaders level activity, you could see an enormous amount of effort that went into the various meetings, task forces, and working groups. And that's, what I tend to focus on when I look at G20 progress or not.
Thank you. Dr. Monica, would you like to share your thoughts on how the G20 Indonesia Summit played out?
Yeah, I think maybe Pak Hendra will be in a best position to also chime in to this question. But I got the privilege to interview one of Indonesia's G20 Sherpas, Ambassador Triansha Jani. So I had a little bit of insights of the diplomacy behind the scene that Indonesia's G20 presidency put into to make this summit a success. So one of them is to train all chairs of all working groups and all engagement groups since February 2020. So all chairs of all these working groups and engagement groups have to be trained multiple times to be able to conduct the meetings, in a conducive way, especially amid the rising geopolitical tensions. Like the Sherpas meetings through the foreign ministers track, for example, were conducted, in a very informal way. One of them was conducted in Finisi boat in Labuan Bajo, and only 20 of the foreign ministers Sherpas were allowed to be in that boat, for example. And if you see on the second day of the G20 summit, just before the session 3 of the summit started, President Jokowi brought oral leaders to walk around the mangrove areas. And I think that's a really good idea, to wake everyone's up and to make sure that they're all awake before the very important session on the second day to conclude the summit. And I agree with Alan that, the importance of the working groups and also the engagement groups. There are 10 engagement groups behind the summit. Indonesia added 2 engagement groups, the Religious 20 and the Supreme Audit Institute's 20. And if you see from the consensus documents that were produced by all these working groups and engagement groups, actually only communiques were produced at the engagement group meetings, but not the working group meetings. So the importance of polylateralism, or the role of non-state actors, I think, in the process towards the G20 summits and declarations is very important too. I guess that's my thoughts on this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'll just quickly ask the next question because we're kind of scarce on time right now. Dr. Colin, I'd like to ask you, was the G20 able to achieve some progress in terms of the priority issues about safety net and debt vulnerability of developing nations in the context of inflation, interest rate increases, and economic crisis? Did the G20 marshal its power to accelerate climate measures? How do you think, how far has G20 come from its inception till now in terms of attaining progress and helping developing countries and dealing with serious issues like hunger and energy as well?
So if you can hold on this, we should give a chance to Pak Handra to add on anything
Good.
Maria Monica Wihardja said, if you wish, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Yves. Yeah, thank you, Rashi. I think maybe I would like to add in what Monica just mentioned, and also related to what Dr. Colin mentioned about, I think, about the figures of our leaders. Mm-hmm. I think one of the aspect, I think, that makes, I think, our successful presidency of G20, I think, for the local support, the support from our people. This is very important because, this is not easy for the big, 275 million people coming from different background and interests, I think, to hold one big event, one international event, you need to make sure that, I think, that the government makes sure that economic must be in the right track. So let's say, because, let's say in our G20, because there are 2 Sherpa, one from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, one from Ministry of Economy. And Minister of Economy in this part, I have to echo, I think, and they had a good job. I think if you could see, I think, the Indonesian economy, I think we still, nowadays, we still can control the inflation, the economic, not like, other countries. One of, I think, what the impetus, why I think the political support from domestic support from the people is very important. I think that's part, and then Mr. Dr. Colin just echo before. And also, I think, back again, when we talk about, I think, in the future, let's say, talking about, I think, our future leadership of G20, let's say, with different leaders. I just want to highlight a little bit regarding like the institutional issue of the issue in Indonesia, because G20 APEC mostly handled by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Coordinating Economic Affairs. So this one, 2 institutions is very relevant, a very significant role in playing in the future. So that's why I've seen also, I think, the current cabinet with President Jokowi, I think many young leaders for the future would, I expect, could carry on I think our good successful presidency or G20 in the future. So I think my point, I think, about, I think, from our domestic side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Handra. We really appreciate you making the time and being with us today and sharing your thoughts. We've learned quite a lot. Thank you so much for that. And I'll just come back to Dr. Colin and ask him about the progress that G20 has achieved in his views. So if you could, share some thoughts about how far G20 has progressed in terms of dealing with inflation and helping developing countries, that'd be great.
Well, thank you very much, Rashi. Yeah, no, it goes right to the point that I was making about frontiers of the feasible. I regret to say that I think the progress, as far as I can tell, I'll elaborate a little bit of detail. I mentioned climate change before as an example of this. I think there's a great consciousness among international economists of the fact that when the US raises interest rates, once again, not surprisingly, raising interest rates on the dollar, which is the most widely held reserve currency, causes capital flows to come out of developing countries into dollar assets. Our exchange rates appreciate, and your developing country exchange rates depreciate, which helps exports, but doesn't help inflation internally nor growth. So it is, I think everybody in the international community and every international economist in the United States is aware of this problem and laments the impact that it's having on developing countries. I think Janet Yellen is an excellent and sensitive, socially sensitive Treasury Secretary, Finance Minister for us. I think there's a problem, as I understand it, and I don't know the technicalities of it, there's a problem in allocating SDRs. And part of that is a technical problem, I think, but also undoubtedly a political problem. And as a consequence, you just don't have a willingness or a capability to respond to the accumulating debt issue in a serious financial way as we should. I think everybody understands that we even have a moral obligation to offset some of the drain and debt, and that it would be a good idea, but I think there are tremendous political and practical difficulties in marshaling the money. And as I understand it, as I was going to check these numbers, but as I understand it, the very important PPR fund that has been established in the World Bank, but it's a partnership basically of the globe to try to get an alert system for pandemics and a surveillance system, a research coordination on health system going, but that the amount of money that's been allocated, that's mentioned in the communique, which I have read carefully, is a fraction of the money that's needed to make it really operate. And so again, on three major issues, on climate change, on debt, and on health, you have a shortfall, financial shortfall. And I think the reason is because of parliaments. And so you come to the understanding that the domestic global interface is really where the problem lies. And we have a world in which all of us in this kind of a setting are looking for a one world. And I praise India for shaping it that way. I hadn't heard until tonight that that's the phrase that Prime Minister Modi has decided on. That's a splendid idea. And I think, so you have those people who are involved in the world who believe that what we need is a one world approach and more multilateralism, but you have the political reaction precisely because market economies haven't generated social outcomes that are politically sustainable. You have this nationalist outcome, which is putting severe limitations on what parliaments are willing to do for, quote, foreign countries. And I think it's not just a US problem. I think it's around the world, and helps explain why ambition isn't fully realized at G20 summits, and why you can't look to G20 summits for final decisions, because final decisions are made on domestic criteria in parliaments and similar types of budgetary institutions in all countries. And it's just a tough reality that we have to face, I regret to say. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. It's great having you here as you're the mastermind behind G20, and hearing from you about the progress. I mean, there's nobody else, I think, better who would be able to tell us more about the progress. And thank you so much for your time. I know we're kind of overboard a little bit, so we'll try and wind up as soon as possible. Dr. Yoshiko, we'd love to hear from you about what your thoughts were on the China-Japan bilateral discussions. Were there any interesting dynamics that you can share with us about what was discussed between China and Japan, or any other Japan-related bilateral, multilateral discussions that you might be aware of?
And the relationship between China and India, sorry, between Japan and India would be interesting, since Japan has the G7.
Certainly.
Yeah, as for the Japan, China and the Japan, South Korea, the relations, I have already mentioned in my previous talk. I think that's good for two countries to rebuild the relationship, because those meetings are the first meeting in almost 3 years. So
Yes.
that, yes, I think that's a good starting point to rebuild the diplomatic relations. So I hope that works well, but it might be very difficult still. And so as for India and Japan relations, I think Japan is very, how do I say, enthusiastic to include India and also to build the diplomatic relations with India. But India is a kind of want to be independent strategically. So I think as for India, maybe Japan want to be more pragmatic, maybe functional relations such as global health, or I said that the quality infrastructure, that kind of things. I think that Japan can make the good relations with India. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Yoshiko. We have a few questions in the panel as well. Like, we won't be able to take all, we'll just take one. We are sorry for the others. Someone has said that, thank you, Professor Yves and friends at MPPGA. It's a question directed to Dr. Bradford. If pluralism and neutrality are keys for international forums and processes like the G20, then wouldn't the more value-driven and traditional international forums like the G7 be redundant? Thank you. Do you have any?
Yeah, no, I don't. Back in the 2008, 2009 period, and the period from 2003 to 2008-9, when we were pushing for this transformation from G7, G8 to G20, I was a replacer. And the story I told you about Prime Minister Harper made the mistake of having, because he had the G7 presidency at the same time he had the G20. And he decided to hold the G7 presidency, G7 summit before the G20. And that caused a major pushback by China and India and others who felt that that was a kind of stacking the deck and the G7 and then coming and cooking the cake before they, the other people had gotten into the kitchen. And so I had the feeling then that it would be a smart move on the part of the West, on the part of Europe and Japan and the US, Canada and Europe, to essentially make it clear, a clear break between a Western bloc, basically, and a G20, and just eliminate the G20. And in some ways, we wouldn't be in the fix that we're in at the moment if that had happened. We wouldn't have this sort of squawk box for the democracy versus autocracy debate. On the other hand, given the fact that not because of China, but because of Russia, the G7 has turned out to be a very good mechanism in terms of rallying the West in relation to Russia in war. So it has its point, and there's no real reason. I mean, the BRICS group exists, the Shanghai Cooperation Group exists, ASEAN exists. I mean, there's no reason why multiple groups can't exist. It's just that the G7 and the G7 plus should not try to preempt the G20, because I think now what we've seen, and I think other countries, Prime Minister Modi, I'm sure will capitalize on this, and I would like to have everybody understand that having Lula become president of Brazil is who thinks of himself as a global player. This is going to be a major thing. He will become part of the Troika, the G20 Troika, on December 1st. And he is looking to make a play in terms of global peace and to make a play on climate, as you've seen in the last few days, and to put Brazil back on the map. And to use, and I think he's been able to do that in the past, and hopefully he can do that again. So the point is that multiple groupings can exist, and the main thing is that the US and Europe and Japan not try to, let me put it more positively, make it clear that this is kind of a Western caucus and a group where shared values and go with shared interests and shared understandings of things, but that it doesn't presume that the G7 viewpoint should prevail in the larger scheme of things. I think what you have to be willing to do is everybody needs to walk through the door into the room of decision making in the global arena, willing to talk with countries that don't agree with you or with whom you do not agree, but have pragmatic, substantive exchanges of views about, okay, we've got a climate problem. I want to understand I want to learn more from you about what your challenges are and how the world can help you meet them. And I would like you to understand some of the challenges that we face and have a conversation, a give and get conversation like that. In the China-West dialogue, we have done that on human rights with Chinese involved in the conversation, and we got somewhere on that subject, believe it or not. And the way we got somewhere was precisely, we had 4 points in the end, and we had to give and get so that each side of that debate was able to see what they needed to get embodied in the document that we produced, and had to give up on some of the things they weren't so high on their priorities. So it's possible, if you see the process being focused on problem solving in relation to systemic existential challenges that must be dealt with, that you keep an eye on the substance and leave your values and ideological prisms at the door, and not play to domestic audiences, just try to educate domestic audiences or get stuff done. A lot of the meetings that Alan has described take place when there's no need for press conferences after these. And even if there are press conferences, the press doesn't write anything about what goes on in some of these things. So there is lots of space for global problem solving and global governance that does not need to pander to domestic politics in any country, regardless of whether it's West or non-West, or what kind of politics or institutional regime it has inside of itself. I mean, I think there's a way, the problems are so urgent and so existential that we just have got to move forward on them, and to not let these parochialisms of like-mindedness get in the way of global problem solving.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bradford, for answering so nicely. We'll now pass the torch to Professor Yves to conclude the event and with this closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya and Rashi, for holding the fort. So thank you to all our wonderful speakers. We're unfortunately out of time, and please accept my apologies for that. We have learned a lot. This was fascinating to have all the different perspectives. And thank you for those really diverse insights that we got. There's still one big mystery that I don't think we have the full answer for. Yesterday, in the evening, the day before, Tuesday night, Kevin Rudd went public at the Asia Society, and he said that as far as he knew, there was a failure in the negotiations around the final communique, and that two countries, Russia and China, were insisted on keeping the war the word war and the word aggression out. So he was very gloomy. He said everything is failing, but by the Wednesday morning for us, everything was fine. So something must have happened overnight, probably a lot of work. I assume that this involved India. I don't know if you know how all this, I see Pakhandra and Ibu Maria Monica smiling. I mean, there must be a whole story there of what exactly happened and how they got to disagreement in the end. And then beyond that, there is a lot of substance. The big question, and if you want to add a word, I'll give you a second next. The really big question is, we know that the global economy, the global system, the global environmental system, ecological system, all of them are beset today by great tensions and by great centrifugal forces, that are pulling cooperation apart, right? So the question is this moment, there was a big burst of meetings, cooperation, a big input of entrepreneurial energy. Is that just a relief point, or is that a turning point? Did it allow to create some lasting cooperation on some dimensions, or was it just a pause, that arrested all those geopolitical tensions and that is to some extent locked in right now? And that too, I'm curious, the future will tell. But maybe I was thinking to very, very briefly conclude, if each of you can have 5 words. If you think, what was the most memorable moment or the most memorable event or the most memorable outcome in less than 5 words, except for Pakhandra and Maria Monica, if you want to add anything on how Indonesia did it, how did they clinch the deal, and I'm sure many things will come out. There was an interview by President Jokowi this morning, right? And he said, oh, it was so hard. It was so painful, and they were brutal, and they were like attacking each other, and etc. So it was very frank from him, but he said in the end we did it. Something interesting did happen in that night, right? Or that night for us, but evening. So maybe I'll turn to Pakhandra first for any final words, just very few.
Thank you, Yves. I think it's very hard to say the final word because what I heard from the prominent speakers is everything just included already. But I think I would like to say, I think G20 is still relevant, and more the middle power will be a continue stance for this.
Wonderful. So Ibu Maria Monica.
Yeah, first of all, thank you again for inviting me to this very, very informative webinar. So of course, I didn't know exactly what happens that turn, the very complex situations on including the word war in the communique. But my hunch is that it's probably, negotiations that perhaps heavily influenced by the middle power countries and the upcoming G20 presidencies, India, Brazil, and South Africa, and other middle power countries. That's my hunch. But again, if I had to just give one last word in this webinar, I think it's time for the global South to play a greater role in reviving globalizations and strengthening multilateralisms, from which they have benefited since the end of the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So next, Dr. Yoshiko Kojo-san.
Okay, thank you for allowing me to participate in this very impressive webinar. So I learned a lot. And so I think the multilateralism survive, but I think in the future, I'm not quite sure. So we should make efforts to reinforce the multilateral framework. I think not only big countries, but also middle parts countries. So that the future is very important. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kojo Sensei. Alan. 1 word, your 5 words.
My 5 words, there'll be a few more than that, but you know, I think strongly what will retain multilateralism would be the shifting coalitions of consensus, and what the middle and major powers, I don't consider some of these countries, India is not a middle power, it's a major power, as is Indonesia. What these countries need to understand is they have to move forward and work with others to begin the consensus process. You don't wait for the United States. You don't wait for China. You move the yardsticks, and in doing so, you slowly build the consensus you need. But waiting for the United States and waiting for China is a bad idea. That's way more than 5 words, but anyway.
Thank you, Alan. And Colin, your 5 words.
I've got, I think, 10, and I'm reading from paragraph 4 of the Leaders' Declaration. It is essential to uphold international law and the multilateral system.
Absolutely.
So let me just say 1 word about that. I think what happened, what that sentence means, and what the Indonesian summit did make a turning point around, you cannot have a community without rules, without principles, without foundations. And with that sentence, if that's held to, we have still, despite everything, despite war, despite the relationship with the US and China being confrontational, and it has been and will continue to be conflictual, but not necessarily confrontational, is that the commitment to principles of law and cooperation embodied in the UN Charter and elsewhere become absolutely vital to the maintenance of a single international community, which is itself necessary for multilateralism and global governance to even begin to function. So I think this is potentially a big turning point. I think that after the 20th Party Congress for President Xi and after the midterms for Biden, I think they each can afford to dial back the wolf warriors and the rhetoric from the US and begin to be a little bit more serious. I think they're certainly reviving some official contacts. Whether they're reviving the 8 suspended and extinguished groups is another story, but they're clearly opening the doors to dialogue, which could help the Global South as it moves forward in its presidencies of the G20. And I hope the other Prime Minister Modi and Lula and the president of South Africa continue to sort of make an effort to play a role in the geopolitics so that the global governance piece of this can function.
All right. Thank you very much, Colin. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience for your patience with technical issues and the time. And terima kasih, Pak Handra and Indonesia and Ibu Monica for this amazing event that the G20 was. So
thank you, Yves.
Thank you, bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers. Good to see you, buddy.